Good evening, everyone. It's lovely to see so many people here at the Courtauld Institute for this year's Leonardo da Vinci Society annual lecture. I'm Alex Marr, I'm president of the Society, and delighted on behalf of the committee to welcome you to tonight's event. We're really fortunate as a society to be able to hold the lectures here at the Courtauld, and I'm very grateful to the Research Forum and to our host, Bobby Brennan, from the Courtauld faculty, and to Diego Artes and other colleagues for supporting this evening's event. The Leonardo da Vinci Society exists to support the study of art and science from the Renaissance to today, with a particular focus on Leonardo and his intellectual worlds and reception. If you're not a member of the Society, why not? Is the simple question. It's free for students, so any students that are here, please join. And others are very, very welcome, and support is always appreciated. We are very lucky today to have one of the most distinguished Leonardeschi in the world, Monica Azzolini, who many of you will know, who I've known for a very long time. She's Associate Professor in History of Science at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Bologna, where she's taught since 2017. Prior to her appointment in Bologna, she was lecturer and then senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh between 2007 and 2017, having previously lectured at the Universities of Washington, Seattle, and New South Wales. She studied at the Cattolica in Milan and at the University of Cambridge, where she was awarded a PhD in 2002 for a dissertation on Leonardo in context, medical ideas and practice in Renaissance Milan, and I believe her supervisor is in the audience this evening. That dissertation spawned some major articles which have really shaped the field, including, and this is my favorite of your works, a study of dispute and scientific entertainment in the Milanese court, which offered really important new insights into not only Leonardo but also Pacioli, and the whole concept of what a scientific come artistic duel could be, as well as a novel analysis of Leonardo's Paragone, which was awarded the 2005 Society of Renaissance Studies Prize for the best article published in its journal. Her dissertation topic will resurface in a much revised form in her forthcoming book, Leonardo Anatomista, Medicina e Arte nella Milano del Rinascimento, which is forthcoming from Carocci Editore, and we all look forward to that very much. Subsequent to her doctoral work, Monica turned to the history of astrology, publishing a major monograph issued by Harvard University Press, The Duke and the Stars, Astrology and Politics in Renaissance Milan, 2013. And more recently, she's worked intensely on subterranean objects and knowledge, with a particular focus on Ulisse Aldrovandi. She's published God knows how many articles now on Aldrovandi, as well as the proceedings of a recent conference on this subject at Itati, which I think is forthcoming as an edited volume, Submerged, Unearthed, Emergent, Early Modern Knowledge Under the Surface, edited with Rebecca Zorak. Monica has also been a tireless advocate for the field. This is something that often goes unsung, but for 2 decades, she's played very important roles in many learned societies. And without the involvement of people like her, these societies simply couldn't function. She served as the History of Science representative at the Renaissance Society of America, and served also as a committee member on the History of Science Society. As I said, the Leonardo da Vinci Society exists to promote study of art and science from the Renaissance to today, and given the interdisciplinary breadth of her distinguished scholarship on Leonardo and the intellectual, political, and material worlds of Renaissance and early modern Italy, Monica Azzolini is really ideally suited to deliver this year's annual lecture on the topic Fear, Desire, and the Deep Darkness, the intellectual discovery of the underworld from Leonardo to Kircher. So please join me in welcoming this year's Leonardo da Vinci Society annual lecturer.
So, well, first of all, I'd like to thank Alexander Ma for the generous, extremely generous presentation and the kind words he has just delivered. I feel very humbled to be here today to present on Leonardo, and as you will see from the talk, Leonardo is one of the major protagonists of this story that traces the intellectual discovery of the underworld, which is my project at the moment. I'm trying to kind of reconstruct how the underworld and the subsoil was rediscovered in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century. So it's a long journey that I'm taking you on today. So I'll start now from way back. The descent into the underworld is, of course, one of the oldest intellectual journeys in Western culture. Dante made it, Virgil made it before him, and Leonardo, perhaps less obviously, made it too, in his own way. So did Athanasius Kircher, whose Mundus Subterraneus of 1650 and 1665 remains one of the most spectacular and possibly underappreciated works of early modern science. It is between these two figures, Leonardo and Kircher, that this lecture finds its center of gravity, though we shall need to begin a little earlier with the classical tradition and with Dante, before following the paths traced by Leonardo, those who followed all the way to Kircher. So let's get started. Anthropologists and literary historians have long been preoccupied with the structure of myth, and in particular with the recurring movement of descent and ascent that so many myths share. Norbert Fry, famously in works like Anatomy of Criticism and The Great Code, argued that one of the defining features of myths is precisely this movement, the hero's descent into the underworld, the capacious, followed by the return to the world above. For Fry, the entire arc of biblical narrative was structured this way, following what he called the U-shaped movement of descent and recovery. Claude Lévi-Strauss was equally fascinated by the recurrence of this structure across cultures and traditions. The descent, or harrowing of hell, served a precise function. It allowed the protagonist to purify the soul, acquire new knowledge, and return to the living world transformed. The story of Orpheus is perhaps the most enduring expression of this pattern in the classical tradition. Both Ovid in the Metamorphoses and Virgil in the Georgics retell the story of Orpheus' love for Eurydice and his descent into Hades to reclaim her. And here you find two images, very different ones, but equally compelling in showing the story, the narrative of Orpheus and Eurydice. And in one we have devilish figures taking her to the underworld. In the other one, and the one by Jacopo da Cellaio, which is one of my favorite pictures nowadays, partly also because of Leonardesque background. You see Eurydice being bitten by a snake. Don't know if you can see it from here. And then dying and being taken to Hades. The myth has been retold across centuries, most notably through the tradition of Ovid Moralizé, and has generated an extraordinary visual tradition depicting either the gates of hell or the underworld itself. As classicist Radcliffe Edmonds has shown in his Myths of the Underworld Journey, Greek culture produced numerous varied stories of descent to hell, each distinct, yet each circling the same fundamental questions about life and death. These myths arose from a fascination with what happens in the moment after death. And as Edmund puts it, the answers to those questions are as varied as the people who ask them. But the underworld always presents a contrast to the everyday world of the living, death and knowledge. This dyad was the animating force of the classical catabasis. The same ancient conviction that caves and underground chambers are the privileged spaces in which ultimate truths are disclosed resonates powerfully in one of the greatest pieces of Latin literature, Aeneas' Descent to the Netherworld in Book 6 of Virgil Aeneid, where the hero travels beneath the earth to seek out the shade of his father, Anchises. It is precisely this tradition, the underworld as a space of revelation, of encounter between the living and the dead, that young Rudolf, the elder, chose to make the subject of his extraordinary series of hellscape paintings, which Christine Riffler has analyzed with such illuminating precision. These are very small pieces. They were made in multiple copies, and this one is the one at the Metropolitan Museum of New York, but there are various copies around Europe. And they're painted on copper, so the shining of copper comes through the colors, and as I said, they're very, very small pieces with numerous details. The outcome of these travels, crucially, was wisdom, a transformed understanding brought back from the encounter with death and the dead. This was not the case in the Christian, Jewish, and Islamic traditions that followed. A substantial body of scholarship, above all the work of Alan Bernstein and Geoffrey Burton Russell, has traced a very different construction of the subterranean within these religions. Here, the underworld is not a place of transformative knowledge, but a site of justice and punishment, inextricably bound to the figure of evil, Satan, the prince of darkness. The contrast with the classical tradition could hardly be sharper, and it's precisely that contrast that sets the scene for what I want to explore today. This Christian tradition underlies Dante's Alighieri's political construction of hell as a domain of rigorously ordered and proportionate punishment, in which sins are classified and judged according to a coherent moral taxonomy. Dante's representation arguably constitutes the most influential synthesis of a fundamentally negative and often deeply unsettling Christian conception of the netherworld, one that would become canonical within Western culture. While the underworld has been extensively examined as a space of both knowledge and emotion by scholars working in classical studies, literary criticism, the history of religion, and anthropology, as I briefly schematically indicated above, the same sustained holistic attention has not been afforded to it within the history of science, and that's what I'm trying to do with this project. My aim today is thus to use Leonardo as an entry point for exploring how caves and underground spaces function within the 15th century intellectual landscape, and how the role and value of the subterranean and of res inanimate or fossilia, the terms that were used at the time, shifted dramatically during the 16th and 17th century. So let's explore the subterranean with Leonardo. Leonardo left memorable notes on the shape of the earth and its formation, scattered across several of his manuscripts. The Lesser Codex and the Codex Arundel, in particular, contain important passages in which he reflected on topics ranging from the shape of the earth as a planet to the formation of fossils and the distribution of water and land. As Martin Kemp argued in his foundational Leonardo da Vinci, The Marvelous Works of Nature and Man, in the last chapter, Leonardo postulated that the Earth's shape was irregular and its composition non-uniform. Yet, as late as 2019, the Leonardo scholar Domenico Laurenza rightly lamented that, and I quote, possibly because the birth of modern geology is situated in the 18th and 19th centuries, and its historiography is relatively recent, no comprehensive or up-to-date studies of Leonardo geological thought had yet appeared, a gap that reflects a broader neglect of medieval and Renaissance geology as a field. Now, the situation has recently been remedied, at least in part, by Ivana Belprete's remarkable account of some key phases of this history, in a book called On the Edge of Eternity, The Antiquity of the Earth in Medieval and Early Modern Europe. It's a very dense but very rewarding book. As Del Prete abundantly demonstrates, none of the theories proposed by Leonardo were particularly new or innovative, though that does not mean, of course, that they were any less interesting. They provide, in fact, important testimony about the variety of theories circulating at the time, belonging to a rich body of knowledge that harks back to classical antiquity, was enriched by the encounter of Greek natural philosophy with Arabic thought, most notably through Avicenna and Averroes, was further elaborated in the Middle Ages, most notably by Isidore of Seville and Albertus Magnus, and reached Leonardo through both Latin and vernacular works. We know, for instance, that Leonardo was familiar with Aristotle's theory that the earth had once been covered by water where land now lies. And while Aristotle himself did not mention marine fossils, successive waves of commentators drew on his account of the cyclical ebb and flow of water and land to explain the existence of petrified sea creatures found far from the sea, the famous Niki that Leonardo found in the mountains and discusses extensively, wondering why these remains of sea creatures can be found so far away from the sea. Now, Lorenzo's recent work on the Codex Leicester, culminating in the definitive 4-volume edition with Martin Kemp, has yielded significant new insight into Leonardo's understanding of cosmology and the Earth's formation. He rightly emphasizes the numerous connections between Leonardo's anatomical studies and his cosmological and geological observations, stressing that these connections were present also, so reference to anatomical and geological observations, were present also in later thinkers, from Steno to James Hutton, the Scottish contender, along with Charles Lyell, for the title of Father of Geology. And here I should spend a word to say that obviously if you've been living in Scotland like I did for 10 years, you will be reminded almost daily that geology was born in Scotland, and Hutton and Lyell are the fathers of this distinguished discipline. The relevance of Steno's training as an anatomist to his geological studies has been beautifully analyzed by Nuno Castelbranco in a 2024 article, and more recently still, incorporated into his 2025 book, The Traveling Anatomist, Nicola Steno at the Intersection of Disciplines in Early Modern Science. So there is certainly more than a grain of truth in saying that anatomy and geology were two disciplines that had a lot in common, and naturalists and thinkers, intellectuals, were often comparing the body of the earth to the body of human beings. But as Ivano Del Prete has highlighted, bodily metaphors comparing processes in the human body to those of the earth were commonplace in natural philosophical works. So it's not just in Leonardo or in Steno, it's actually a very common occurrence. Del Prete draws attention, for example, to the theme of fluid circulation in the human body and within the earth, in the influential composition of the world written in 1282 by the 13th century Italian friar Ristoro d'Arezzo. It was written in Italian, circulated widely across Tuscany and Italy in its original vernacular, and was later translated in Latin and published as late as the early 16th century. Now, Ristoro's composition wove empirical observation together with a theoretical framework drawn from Aristotle and mediated by Averroes, Albertus Magnus, and other medieval authorities. So there are similarities in Ristoro's work with the approach that Leonardo had in his own writing, comparison of the classical sources, the sources of medieval philosophers and Arab philosophers, and also the empirical observation that was coming from direct experience. Now, together with anatomy, other areas of Leonardo's research may have been equally influential in shaping his views on the workings of the subterranean. namely his studies of hydraulics, land surveying, and water management. And here I'm showing you some of my favorite pictures. Some of you will know them better than others. This is a map that Leonardo drew when he was employed under Giuliano de' Medici and under the papacy to try and drain the Pontine marshes. The work of the draining the Pontine marshes becomes nearly an obsession for the church from the early 16th century and was never completed until Benito Mussolini came to power and managed to force this project upon the population of the area. This is just a plan that Leonardo tried to put together to resolve a problem that was lasting and unresolved for a very, very long time. And this drawing is in the Royal Collection, of course. But also, you can see the studies of the Arno that he completed around 1506, I believe. And these were studies that were commissioned by the Signoria, trying to divert the Arno, and you have a drawing of the Arno west of Florence. Sorry, I misspelled Florence, that's terrible, Florence. And the Arno east of Florence. And just to give you another one of my favorite drawings, this is actually a bird's eye view, much more conservative in style, but equally exceptionally beautiful and very important, of Western Tuscany that Leonardo drew. It was often the work of water engineers to draw this type of maps, and this is something that you find extensively in our Italian archives. There are maps of this kind by various architects, engineers at various Italian courts. Most Renaissance engineers and architects were engaged across multiple domains, like Leonardo was, construction and water management prominent among them. The relationship between water and earth, as we shall see also with Kircher, was central to any understanding of the earth and of the subterranean spaces within it. While geology did not yet exist as a discipline, this does not mean that medieval and Renaissance thinkers were inattentive to what lay beneath the surface, particularly those who, like Leon Battista Alberti and Leonardo himself, were engaged in construction work. So let's now compare the following two passages. The first from Alberti and the second from Leonardo. Apologies, there are only a few long quotations, but I think they're very important. And they, meaning those who have researched sources of water, Alberti on the outer building was talking about finding water and resolving the problem of diverging water if it was in the wrong place. I've observed that in mountains, these skins, he uses the word cutes, are heaped and piled up on one above the other, so that on the outside, their layers and joints run horizontally from right to left. But on the inside, the skins slope downwards towards the center of the mountain, and the entire outer surface is inclined equally, although the lines do not continue uninterrupted. About every 100 feet, the skins are cut off abruptly by a diagonal line to form steps. Then, by a similar gradation, the layers run in continuous steps from either side of the mountain to the very center. Leonardo's passage instead reads, but in the mountains, where the rock strata are positioned obliquely and steeply, being covered by only a thin layer of earth, the rainwater immediately penetrates the soil and flows through the fissures of the stones, and the water mingles with them and fills the veins and cavernous spaces. Furthermore, the snow that melts from the Alps with a slow toe, held back by the presence of roots and the leaves of the tiny meadow grasses, penetrates more easily through the cracks of the rocks, and they run along the said roots of the grasses. Thus, beyond that melted snow which in summer swells the rivers, a great part is that which penetrates through the set cracks in the rocks that make up the mountains. Why have I chosen these passages? Both passages reveal how direct observation of natural phenomena combined with concepts drawn from natural philosophy, at least occasionally, deepen these authors' understanding of the Earth's composition, its history and its transformation. To borrow Lydia Burnet's felicitous term for 18th century practitioners, but I argue this term is equally suitable for much earlier practitioners, and I mean laborers of low social standing, quarrymen, shepherds, ditch diggers, and field workers. To borrow Lydia Burnet's felicitous term for 18th century practitioners, both Alberti and Leonardo worked in close contact with earth workers. These laborers of low social standing, quarrymen, shepherds, ditch diggers, and field workers, whose daily toil in and upon the earth yielded vital discoveries about subterranean specimen and the planet's underlying structure. As such, they had ample chances to reflect on both the constitution of the Earth's surface and its many layers, caves and channels. Indeed, in Del Puerte's words, and I quote, while largely ignored by historians of geology, Alberti's passage is arguably the first detailed description in Western literature of the characteristics and directions of rock strata extending beneath the surface. This was a phenomenon that quarrymen and miners had doubtless observed long before in their explorations of the subterranean. Indeed, as Alprete stresses, the water prospector would have had little patience for Alberti's generalizations, being well aware that nature accommodates a far greater diversity of orientations and inclinations between fault lines. Having established that Renaissance sources reveal varying degrees of knowledge of subterranean spaces, not only through the writings of natural philosophers, but even more vividly through the direct and indirect observation of engineers, diggers, and builders concerning the strata and composition of the soil, I would now like to return to the emotions most commonly associated with these spaces in the Renaissance imagination. Fear was certainly foremost among them, insofar as the subterranean realm was clearly identified with hell. Hell, to borrow Simon Kronenberg's expression, stank of sulfur. It was dark, dangerous, and largely devoid of life. In short, the prevailing view among Europeans was that descending beneath the Earth's surface was far from alluring. Rather, it was perceived as an undertaking fraught with danger and dread. But fear was not the only emotion associated with the subterranean world. From the Renaissance onwards, it was increasingly accompanied by curiosity and by efforts to know, describe, and imagine these spaces more concretely. The most remarkable example of its representation are certainly those inspired by Dante's Divine Comedy. So Dante, as a quintessential negative representation of hell, becomes actually a stimuli for rethinking this space and its reality. The Tuscan architect, sorry, this was a quotation, but I'm skipping that bit. The Tuscan architect Antonio di Tuccio Manetti famously inaugurated a rich tradition stretching across 2 centuries of scholarly inquiry aimed at locating and measuring the shape of hell. So this one is a representation from a 15th century manuscript and the traditional view of hell created by the fall of Satan. And here you see its legs sticking out. So that commonly also in textbooks from my memories of school and high school when I was studying Dante, there is always a drawing of this sort. In any Italian textbook that explains Dante to you, we have this drawing, so they're very, very familiar. But what I want to discuss is this Antonio Manetti's text. So Manetti aimed at locating and measuring the shape of hell, and he wrote a book about that. In its influential reconstruction, Manetti placed the entrance to hell near Como and Lake Avernus in southern Italy. Famously, the young Galileo had devoted his first lectures at the Accademia Fiorentina to the same theme. And this is just to give you an idea of how seriously intellectuals of the time took this topic. From Manetti's work onwards, there was a very lively discussion about the shape and dimension of hell, very much similarly to the dimension of the arc that Kircher was engaged in. So famously, the young Galileo wrote 2 lessons on the shape, location, and size of Dante's Inferno, in which he applied mathematical physics to settle conclusively the controversy that had for decades set 2 competing interpretations of Dante's description against one another, that of the Florentine Manetti and that of the Lucchese Alessandro Velutello. And if you're Tuscan, you know that the Lucchesi and the Fiorentini don't like each other, so there was also some good dose of campanilismo and local animosity between these 2 authors. Significantly, for our purposes, hell was situated just beneath the surface of the holy city of Jerusalem, and you see it up here. Christian virtue and human sin were separated by nothing more than a physical divide, soil. Another among the most remarkable illustrations of hell is that of Johannes Stradamus that you see here, beautiful drawing at the Laurenziana. Similarly, what I really like about this painting is actually the accuracy of depicting these blocks of rocks that, of course, kind of shape the conic form of hell, testifying to the enduring vitality of this Florentine tradition. So it lasts a couple of centuries. This wavering between the fear of hellish darkness and the desire of knowing is clearly present in the famous passage, in the famous Leonardo passage in Codex Arundel. And drawn by my eager desire, desirous of seeing the great confusion of the various and strange forms created by ingenious nature, having wandered for some distance among the overhanging rocks, I came to the mouth of a huge cavern, before which, for a time, I remained stupefied, having been ignorant of its existence. This remarkable passage captures Leonardo's profoundly ambivalent feeling towards the subterranean. And by the way, this is probably something that he imagined rather than lived through. Stupefied by the existence of this vast cave, he nevertheless entered it, at least metaphorically. Having piegato le mie reni in arco, having bent my back in an arc, and having pursed my tired hand over my knee, with my right shading my lowered eyelids, and bending here and there to see if I could discern anything inside it, this was impossible, as it was deeply dark inside. And 2 things emerged within me, fear and desire. Fear of the menacing and dark cave, and desire to see if it contained anything marvelous. It uses the word miracoloso, but those 2 terms, as Dustin and Park have amply discussed, were synonymous at the time. So if it contained any marvelous things. Now I want to take you further ahead. We're going to explore the subterranean after Leonardo and see how this tradition of dealing with earth and soil and digging and building created a momentum for the creation of a new discipline. The Quattrocento was also the heyday of Italy's economic prosperity. As Richard Goldwhite masterfully documented, the Renaissance would have been unthinkable without the vast commercial networks that developed across the Italian states during the Middle Ages and sustained their economies and generated sufficient wealth to be invested in art and monumental enterprises alike. Within this narrative of economic flourishing, extractive practices have generally been assigned a marginal role. And rightly so, since mineral extraction in the late Middle Ages and in Leonardo's time remained a relatively modest affair, although Tuscany had a bigger role than any other part, with the exception of the Alps in producing and extracting minerals from the earth. Things started to change in the early 16th century, and vivid testimony of this economic, intellectual, and scientific change is represented by a series of important publications that marked a new phase in the exploration of the nether regions. Bernoccio Biringuccio della Pirotecnia appeared in 1540, while Georg Agricola di Orto et Causis Subterranorum and the Re Metallica were printed in 1546 and 1556, respectively. These three texts represent the earliest printed accounts of mining practices, an activity with ancient roots that had significantly flourished by the early modern period across the Holy Roman Empire and in Italy, as I said, especially in Tuscany and in northeastern and northwestern Alpine regions. While drawing upon Aristotelian natural philosophy and its theories of matter, these works function more as practical handbooks of expertise than as systemic natural philosophical or cosmological treatises. While containing some elements of Aristotelian natural philosophy, the first of these works, the Pirotecnia, derived directly from the tradition of Italian artists and engineers, of which Leonardo belonged to, and was mostly experience-oriented. Agricola's writing significantly advanced the field by providing a much deeper and richer philosophical context to the extensive extractive practices prevalent in Chimneys, Saxony, where he had relocated as a doctor. The De Orte Causis Subterranorum is certainly the most philosophical of Agricola's treatises. It not only details the nature of the subsoil, but also focuses on the causality of its processes of generation and transformation, as the title indicates. Historians of alchemy, in particular, have explored extensively how these extractive practices sustain the economies of various principalities within the Holy Roman Empire. I'm thinking of Pamela Smith and Sebastian Felten more recently. The attention has only recently moved to consider how similar practices developed in Italy. At the moment, the best research has been carried out in relation to Medici Florence, where the archives are actually quite rich. But it's hoped that this work will extend to other Italian regions. Interest in the soil and the subterranean did not remain the exclusive concern of miners and the princes who employed them, however. Before long, natural philosophers and natural historians once again began interrogating the earth's composition and mineral formation. The Bolognese naturalist Ulisse Aldobrandi, of which I've written extensively, maybe I should stop at some point. But it's one of the richest collection of papers, so it's really, there is endless enjoyment in discovering something new. The Bolognese naturalist Ulisse Aldobrandi, for example, developed a sustained research program to investigate res inanimate, and corresponded frequently with the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Francesco I, and later with his brother, Ferdinando, about the nature of soil. As a learned physician and naturalist, Aldobrandi returned to the canonical texts. He read Aristotle, Theophrastus, Pliny, and Albertus Magnus, while also engaging with more recent authors, among them the polymath Girolamo Cardano, who had discussed the properties of various mineral and lithic substances, especially the very strange ones. Aldobrandi read widely in the alchemical literature, much of it originating in the German lands, and even consulted Paracelsus, who was back then on the list of prohibited books, given the relevance of mineral specimens to medical practice. He had planned a Historia Fossilium, a history of everything dug from the soil, which he never completed, but which formed the basis of the posthumous publication of his Museum Metallicum. As well as studying these natural substances and writing about them, Aldobrandi exchanged these objects with numerous correspondents. Several examples exist, but few stand out for their importance. A letter to Francesco I, again, in the early autumn of 1577, for instance, was accompanied by a box of 25 natural objects and a list of its content. The box included some reddish inflammable turf from the central Apennine Mountains, some osteocolon, a special earth from Saxony that was believed to help seal broken bones, the purest Ralgar from Bohemia, Swiss sulfur from the Margravate of Baden, a bituminous earth called Eld lard by the Germans, a nickel stone containing small round speckles coming from the thermal baths near Prague, and some soot of yellow copper from the furnaces of Pergine near Trent. All 25 items belong to the mineral world, and their provenance was varied. Aldobrandi provided a brief description, he calls it a historia, of each of them, often lingering on their physical characteristics and their properties, medical and non-medical, as in the case of the sarcophagus lapis, and here I quote, which Dioscorides calls lapis azius because it is found in azus in the throat. So he tries to kind of also collect the various names of these substances as they change in their sources. The stone, Aldobrandi explained, took its name from the ability to consume the bodies of the dead, quite apt that a substance from the subterranean world would consume the human remains buried within it. So Aldobrandi particularly liked this one because it was functioning as something that was creating more substance under the surface. There were marvelous and surprising things beneath the surface, and still more surprising and marvelous things could be obtained by investigating their characteristics and properties. In sending these specimens to Francesco I, Aldobrandi expressed the hope that the Grand Duke might subject them to empirical testing to verify their purported properties. Aldobrandi made specific reference to the Duke's alchemical laboratory, the Casino di San Marco, where craftsmen produced divine preparations, manufactured the much coveted Medici porcelain, forged remarkable crystal vases, cut the hardest porphyry, and transformed lapis lazuli into beautiful vessels, like this one that is now in Palazzo Pitti. It's one of my favorite also because we do have the design by Bernardo Bontalenti, and we also now know from chemical analysis that the lapis lazuli came from Afghanistan because of its impurities within it. So they could rule out that it was, for example, a lapis lazuli from Peru, which was another site of provenance. By the late 16th century, the subterranean had become both a resource and an occasion of for experimentation. Its richness finally reimagined and revalued as a site of marvel. As noted, Aldobrandi collected numerous res inanimate. In his Discorso Naturale, his intellectual manifesto, he claimed to have housed these objects in 4,554 small drawers. They formed an integral part of his ambitious project to assemble a thesaurus of nature. The larger specimens were likely displayed openly, while smaller ones were collected and classified in those drawers. And here you see some of these stones, some are agates and others, the green ones. He was very interested in some of these green stones because they had apotropaic properties. But the thing that I wanted to highlight here is that these are not necessarily natural specimens. They've been worked by man, they've been polished, and some were also carried on the body, like these ones with little ribbons. Less than 2 decades after Aldobrandi's death, another group of naturalists, the Lincei, turned their attention to rocks and fossils. While the drawings they commissioned reveal a broad interest in subterranean matter, the focus of their brief but intense investigations became mainly, if not exclusively, as we will see, fossil wood. The Academy had been founded in 1603 and was dissolved upon the death of its founder, the Roman nobleman Federico Cesi, in 1630. In a letter to Cardinal Francesco Barberini dated 1st of December 1624, Federico Cesi, Duke of Aquasparta, described his findings. Apologies, it's a long text. It's the only and last really long piece. In the little free time my troublesome affairs have left me, I pursued my physical observations, and particularly the new form of middle nature between plants and metals. On the veined and varied mineralized wood discovered by me some years ago in this region, was near Apostata, where his estate was, and which I have already brought to you. So this earth circulated and was gifted from one person to another. I found a great variety of petrified objects, that is, some completely petrified, of the consistency of stone or brick, or mixed, part wood, part stone, or a similar condition, with internal and external combinations in many forms. That which gave me the greatest cause, first of wonderment, then for reflection, was the discovery of metallized woods, and those which were similarly either completely or partially transformed into metal and strangely altered. I believe this phenomenon to be something completely unexpected by natural historians. I've also been obtaining, he says, as much as it is permitted to me to skim over them in writing, not only the full historical point of view, but also every natural consideration and discussion that have been able to contemplate in searching for causes and examining how much can be found about these subjects or concluded from them. So we're moving from observation and the search for textual evidence to join to the examination of the causes, so a more kind of philosophical intention to figure out how this material was formed within the body of the earth. On such occasions, I've also observed furnaces kindled by nature, their manner, and their fumes. I also saw in this new class of things the sulfurous efflorescence as well as the saline, vitreous, and crystalline ones, and I confirmed with particular satisfaction many of my theories. So he presumably had hypotheses that were proven by experience. Now, Chase did not manage to continue his research on fossilized wood. He died 3 years later, sealing the fate of his beloved academy. Drawing on Chase's studies, his friend and longtime collaborator, Francesco Stelluti, penned a short treatise on fossilized wood. And you see the treatise here. The treatise on the newly discovered mineral fossil wood, accompanied, as Stelluti himself noted, by illustrations showing the wood's place of origin. There is a bird's-eye map within the book on Chase's vast estate, the diversity of its undulations, and its varied and wondrous forms. This treatise, too, was addressed to Francesco Barberini, the addressee of Chase's letter that I've just quoted, and printed in Rome by Mascardi, kind of the printer of the Desirous Mexicanos, the big work that the Lince produced in 1637. As the numerous drawings from Cassano del Pozzo's collection housed in the Royal Collection beautifully illustrate, fossil wood was not Chase's only interest. His museum included numerous other precious and semi-precious stones and minerals. As the Royal Collection catalogue notes, many of the gems depicted have been prized since antiquity for their apotropaic qualities, that is to say, their ability to avert evil influences, and in Cassiano's time were also valued as materia medica, so medicine, for their therapeutic properties. Several are shown pierced and threaded for wearing, very much like, none of these images shows it, but there are other pictures that show, I couldn't find it today, I was looking for it, but I couldn't find one that was showing the threads for wearing these minerals. Not unlike the specimens from Aldobrandi's collection that I've shown you earlier. In both Aldobrandi's museum, Metallicum and Stelluti's and Chase's writings, the rhetoric of marble was on full display. And so I come to the conclusion of my lecture. No other author summarized more effectively the epistemological shift I've tried to document today than Athanasius Kircher. The shift, as I hope to have shown, was driven by curiosity and by direct encounter with the subterranean in a variety of ways. And it transformed the way the earth was understood, laying the groundwork eventually for the birth of a new discipline, geology. Kircher's work was profoundly and directly shaped by the Roman environment he inhabited. There were, as noted, the recent studies of the Lincei and overlapping patronage networks with the Barberini. He was under the patronage of the Barberini cardinal himself. But we should not underestimate the significance of contemporary efforts to explore the underground around Rome and Lazio and elsewhere in Italy for Kircher's own investigations of the natural world below the surface. As I've discussed in detail in a recent publication, Kircher's Rome was teeming with construction sites, reflecting a period of intense urban growth and transformation. The 16th century was, in essence, the golden age of underground exploration in Rome, when the city's classical and Christian foundations were laid bare, and archaeological scholarship reached an unprecedented level of sophistication. This period was inaugurated by the momentous rediscovery of major sites and monuments, such as the Laocoon in 1506. The detailed work of Barbara Furlotti, Elizabeth Schwab, and Anthony Grafton has amply demonstrated how Renaissance scholars and artists, through their keen interest in Roman ruins, established the foundational principles of the systematic archaeological practices that would develop in subsequent centuries. And so they argue that this led to the birth of archaeology as we know it today, rather than geology. From the mid-16th century onwards, moreover, Rome became the focus of large-scale investigations into the material and archival remains of early Christianity. The exploration of Rome's catacombs, documented most notably by Antonio Bosio in his Roma Sotterranea of 1635, significantly contributed to the field of Christian archaeology. The Jesuits, alongside the Oratorians, were heavily involved in these excavations and in the trade in early Christian relics, which extended as far as Southeast Asia and South America. So they were digging out these relics and then sending them around the world through that Jesuit network. The Mondo Subterraneo reveals continuity with Kircher's other major topographical work, his Latium of 1669. As Harry Evans has argued, Kircher's interest in the topography of Italy, Tuscany, and Lazio in particular, had led him to write a related account of a journey, the Iter Etruscum, a text that was never published because of the censorship, because it had wild ideas about the Etruscan culture and therefore didn't pass Jesuit censorship. In Kircher's own words, he describes this work that was never published. The work was a long-term undertaking requiring considerable investment of time and money. A book, and you see here, in which Etruscan civilization is described from Noah's offspring to the present day. Its political status is set forth, and marvelous things of nature are explained, which are observed in its mountains, cities, territories, rivers, lakes, and its many, many hot springs. Kircher had traveled personally to various sites and planned a lavishly illustrated publication. His investigations near Viterbo led him to encounter people living underground. And I quote again, in a manner like that of the troglodytes of Malta, a settlement under the jurisdiction of Prince Camillo Pamphili. So he had found this community living underground in Viterbo, but he had, earlier on, he had traveled to Malta and he had asked the Inquisitor of Malta to take him to various islands to explore and study these communities that were living underground. Kircher stressed that he had employed a local guide and seen these places firsthand, while noting that Jesuit annual letters attested similar subterranean habitations elsewhere, in parts of India, Africa, and near the Caspian Sea. If mines were trading zones, to borrow Pamela Long's apt expression, so were catacombs, where antiquarian interests mingled with theological and scientific concerns. places where there was room not only for an economy of relics, but also for scientific observation. It is no surprise, therefore, that the hellish, punitive landscape of the medieval imagination slowly gave way to a more capacious and transformative vision of the subterranean, a realm rich in natural resources, harmonious and ordered accordingly to God's providence. It is precisely this vision that animates Kircher's dedication letter to Pope Alexander VII, the same man that took him around Malta to see the communities of these troglodytes that were living below the surface. There, Kircher endows the summum sacerdotem with the gift of light, casting him as a radiant manifestation of divine power, at once guide and source of illumination. In order to, and I quote, enter the underworld, which is hidden from us and leading to a more shrouded world, Kircher pleads emphatically, may I be permitted to enter my foot fearlessly. For the introductions which I consider writing, the introduction to the first and the second book, I must trust your propitious work, by whose light I may describe this darkness clearly, lest the darkness tramples upon me, wandering and toiling in the labyrinth of the lower world. The Virgilian and Dantesque undertones are unmistakable. Yet, what Kircher goes on to present across hundreds of dense pages is something far removed from those infernal landscapes. A world teeming with life, natural resources, and precious materials. The subterranean, by the mid-17th century, had become a site not of punishment and dread, but of marvel and abundance. Kircher's ambition to describe the nature and functioning of the Earth system attempted to move beyond the negative emotional response to the underworld by intertwining religious pathos with the rhetoric of the marvelous. Both in the dedication letter and elsewhere in the work, Kircher underscores the vital force of light and it dispels darkness and illuminates new pathways to understanding both nature and God's powers. The earth as a harmonious living organism permeated by channels carrying water, fire, exhalation, and essential fluids. In it, tunnels and caves are vital for the planet's life and sustenance, much like veins in the human body. And here I read a passage from the Mundus. In order to produce the effects characteristics of nature, this confluence of causes operates only through the innumerable channels and receptacles of which the Earth's body is made, literally perforated, just as though certain fibers and vessels of the macrocosm, with each cause distributing itself in a manner appropriate to the terrestrial substance. While in Book 1, Kircher develops a general natural philosophy of the Earth as a system, in Book 2, the emphasis is on natural particulars, on what the body of the Earth, or more precisely, its fertile womb, produces. So, Kircher describes the content of this second volume as follows. It only remains for us to proceed to the consideration of the remaining books of this second volume concerning the particular fruit and offspring of the earth, which the most fertile womb of the geocosm brings forth at every opportune time in great abundance, and to explore the powers and properties of each and the proximate causes of such great effects. This world, it tells us soon after, is full of marvels. Furthermore, with what skill it, meaning nature, has fashioned bones of gigantic size and horns, moreover, of prodigious length in its hidden workshop. With what ingenuity, too, it has brought forth fossil wood beneath the earth and coral plants of incredible workmanship from the rocks of the sea beneath the sea. All these things are revealed in the 8th book. In another work, the Magnus, Kircher had declared that, and I quote, the earth, as the common mother and womb of all things, also contains the seeds of all things in itself. And that the earth, and I quote again, was pregnant with a certain panspermia or universally generative mix of seeds. Seeds or semina contained a vis plastica, a formative power that contained in potentia their form. Key to Kircher's cosmology was that this fertility was generated by the rays of the sun and its representative, the Pope. Plants, he argued, could have virtues, even lethal ones, precisely because of the place where they grew. For example, in Persia, Kircher tells us, there is a peach tree that produces lethal fruits, while in Europe, these are not only edible, but tasty. So place was important in establishing the virtues of these plants and minerals. Significantly, however, these are all parts of God's plan, and as such, they need to be admired and studied to meditate on the providence and greatness of the divine Creator. Again, just as the most wise architect, Kircher says, just as the most wise architect of the world has mingled good with evil, impure with pure, harmful with wholesome, in the threefold realm of nature, so also it seems best to discuss most fully in the 9th book the deadly parts of the earthly world, that is, the origin, nature, and powers of poisons. So he dedicates a whole section of the book to poisons. But then he says, where the reader will clearly understand that nothing so pernicious and destructive has been produced in the subliminal world by God, the best and greatest creator of all things, that does not contain within itself a remedy for the life which its virulent poisons destroy, so that from such great evil, good, from the harmful, the harmless, and finally from the deadly, the salutary, can be produced by it alone. So even poison, there are more than one echo of Paracelsus in this section. The core rhetorical effect of this insistent use of anaphora, that is the direct contrast between the two opposing concepts, has the function to add emphasis to his message, building intensity and momentum. Wonder almost simultaneously engages the reader emotionally. Both of these elements together work to persuade the reader through an emotional response about the greatness and goodness of God and all he has created. As the Genesis had remained rather silent about the creation of the mineral kingdom, something that occasionally was mentioned and commented upon, and life below the surface, as the Genesis had remained rather silent about the creation of the mineral kingdom and life below the surface, Kircher had a free hand. He was almost working on a blank canvas where he could let his fertile imagination run wild. Kircher's Mundus Subterraneus was yet another manifestation of the providence and benevolence of God and its creation, Kircher's own kind of natural theodicy. The subterranean was finally a space to be glorified, explored and exploited, metaphorically but also practically. Thank you.